Good morning. It's Wednesday, April 20th, 2022, and this is the second half of the session for Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We're taking up work again on H697, an act relating to eligibility of reserve forest land for enrollment in the use value appraisal program. And we're receiving testimony. Our first guest this morning is Mr. Wood. So, good morning. I'm going to say good morning, Woody, since we co-chaired a biomass development energy working group a decade, actually more than a decade ago. Good to see you again.
Good to see you, Chairman Bright.
So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much. I have to apologize up front. I have a little voice issue going on with seasonal allergies. If my voice gives out completely, Ed Larson has agreed to read my comments for you, and I'll hang in for questions. So I'm going to talk a little slower than usual, which is probably fine. My name is Jonathan Wood. I'm a private consulting forester in northern Vermont. I'm also a SAF certified forester, a licensed Vermont forester. I'm a member of the Vermont Forest Products Association, member of the Society of American Foresters, but the comments that I'm going to make today are my own. They don't reflect any membership or affiliation with any other organization. I need to make a few disclosures right up front. I do make money as a consulting forester through the current use program, but I'm also going to argue against myself in that I think I'd have more business if this bill passed as written. Presently, if someone doesn't want to cut any trees on their land, I tell them the program's not for them and I don't have a client. If they were able to choose not to cut any trees, I would have more business. So I'm really not advocating for a way for me to make more money. I'm advocating against that. My final disclosure, I apologize if I have to clear my throat commonly. I'll do my best. My final disclosure, I'll say, even though Senator Westman's not in the room, I am the forester for Senator Westman and his family. And I disclose that for disclosure purposes, not to try to get sympathy from the rest of the committee.
You have it. You have it.
And he will be back. He's at a appropriations event and should be back shortly.
Well, he's heard all of my concerns, so I'll proceed. Current use is the most important, long-lasting, and successful conservation program in Vermont history. It has really been a wonderful thing for our forests, for our forest landowners, and it's so important we really don't want to mess with it too much. H697 would bring a fundamental and historic change to the program. For the first time in history, an entire parcel would not have to have any productive timber management on the parcel. And that's a significant and a little bit scary item for those of us in the forest products industry that depend on that resource. I support the goals of this legislation. I support the establishment and reestablishment of old growth forest conditions in Vermont. I support the goals of Vermont conservation design, but current use is not the mechanism to get there. And I would, it's just the wrong place to try to do that for many reasons. And what I'm asking you today is to be careful. The legislature has asked us for the last 20 years as foresters and forest industry and forest landowners to be more careful in what we do, to be thoughtful, to really do rigorous work, investigation, and scientific efforts. And I'm simply asking you folks to do the same thing when it comes to legislation that affects the most important program we have for conservation of forest resources in the state. There's also no crisis or overriding reason to pass this right now. I just don't see why we can't wait, have more testimony, really look at the ramifications and unintended consequences. There's nothing that's going to happen if you don't pass this year. Forest and Parks is not out making people cut their trees. They have tremendous amount of flexibility. There are many landowners working towards old growth characteristics on their land, enrolled in current use, and nothing's going to change by not passing this legislation. Many things will change if you do. There are many issues about this. The Forest and Parks Recreation has estimated the eligibility level for this change at 860,000 acres. That's a staggering amount of land. That's many, many, many jobs. That's millions of board feet or cords of wood over a year even, at minor harvesting levels. Vermont Conservation Design, which is the premise by which this goal is put forward, calls for 9% of Vermont to be set aside to reattain old growth characteristics. That number is 419,000. According to Forest and Parks, we already have 218,000. So a little more than 200,000 is the goal that's needed to be attained to reach that scientifically recommended level. So why are we looking at current use as a model at all? And why are we making 860,000 acres eligible that will come directly out of the productive resource base? That's over 4 times the amount recommended. And you're also looking at H606, which calls for levels of 30% and 50% of permanently conserved land. I'm curious why there's no nexus between the two legislations. You look at what's going to be accomplished under 606 and what this opens up for. We're talking about major portions of the landscape set aside from timber harvesting. That'll change the entire character of our state. If that's where we want to go, I understand that, but it's a scary premise. And I'm concerned because I truly believe that a long-term successful rural working landscape is the best conservation tool we have. People being able to own land for the long term, invest in it, care for it, and have a vibrant market for those products, be able to make economic income from that land. And for industries and loggers, sawmillers, truckers to succeed really saves most of our land in the most efficient and appropriate way. When we lose that rural working landscape, we're really going to be sorry. I really believe in the long term, that's going to be a tremendous detriment to the goal of keeping forests forests. One of the issues that I see tremendously around here is intergenerational transfer of land. That's an issue that hasn't been addressed. And that's an issue that'll affect the goals of this bill. When a landowner sets aside land within the confines of this legislation and has a forest reserve, there's no permanency to that at all. It's not going to be protected long-term like it should be to attain old growth characteristics. That same landowner can change their mind. When that same landowner, if they're very committed, reaches the end of their life, then the children or heirs of that individual have to break that land up and separate the assets for the number of heirs there are. I deal with this all the time in my business, and it's creating a tremendous strain. That's what's causing parcelization and fragmentation. And that will cause the intent of this bill to be undone in the future. It's also ironic that the goals of Vermont conservation design can never be reached by this legislation. These forest reserves are not permanent in nature. So despite if you enact this, the land set aside won't meet those goals. And the advocates will say, well, it doesn't count, even though they're going to advocate today and have advocated that this is a great way to do that. It simply is not, because there is no permanency in current use, and there shouldn't be. That's one of the successful elements of the program. I wish we were working on intergenerational transfer, invasive species, climate change, things that I see in everyday work that are really affecting Vermont. I think we're well on our way to setting aside ecological reserves, and I think there's more that can be done, and that should be done through other mechanisms. It just really should. One of the things about Vermont conservation design as well is where we do this and how we do this. Having little postage stamps that are created by landowner desire, basically a landowner preference, not scientific rigor, not whether this land is appropriate as an ecological reserve or a forest reserve, but whether a landowner wants to do it. That's not a scientific approach to how we attain these goals. And that's simply a way to do this that looks good and sounds good, but is just meeting the goals of individual landowners. You get little postage stamps all over the state. They're not going to be concentrated in the areas that are necessary. Areas that are meaningful are already identified within Vermont conservation design. There are things like the sandplain forests of Chittenden County, the clayplain forests of Addison County, your home county, Chairman Bray. Those are where we're missing representative types of ecosystems that need to be reserved. This bill will not achieve that. Why isn't agricultural land part of this? To reestablish some of those forests, we're going to have to look carefully at development land in Chittenden County, at clayplain forests that are in agricultural use in Addison County. That's where we would achieve the goals of Vermont conservation design. But I realize that's very hard to do. But the instability that this creates with the resource base is a primary concern. And I don't own any timberland, and I don't have any money invested in the forest products industry. I'm a kind of a semi-retired part-time forester. And I'm really saying this because I care about our forests. When you don't have a predictable resource base, you're not going to make investments in a sawmill or in logging equipment. These are things that need to be looked at long-term. As a forester, I look out 100 years or more. When you're an investor in a forest products industry, how are you going to know what's going to be there for a resource base when huge chunks of it are potentially can be taken out of production? That's just not an appropriate way and is an economic harm to our state. I'm concerned about additional changes to this over time if you pass it. One of the more concerning things is in the future, what happens. Within the report and considerations that Forest Parks and Recreation did, they looked at core forest areas, which has been greatly in discussion. They didn't add it as an issue because it would be too much land, but that could happen in the future. You need to understand the authority that's given to the commissioner. And I'll remind you, you never know who could be commissioner. History will show you that. The commissioner can change these standards at any time without legislative input, without public input. This could become broader than 860,000 acres with whoever the commissioner might be's desire. So there's no stability even in the numbers that are given. A slight tweak to one of the ESTA categories can change the eligibility. The addition of things like core forest areas or habitat connectors could dramatically expand the eligibility to millions of acres. How are we going to have any predictability in the resource base? The other thing I'm worried about is there's been no rigorous research related to the forest products industry. So how much resource do we need? How much we've talked greatly and studied tremendously how much forest reserves we might need or conserved land we might need, and we need more. But how much working forest resource base do we need to sustain the working landscape? There's been no work on that. I'd like to see you pause, wait on this legislation, and make a balance scientifically. Look into what's needed for resource base and where. Do we have enough? How are we going to impact those industries? Is that going to be detrimental to keeping forest as forest over time? We really need to look into that tremendously. There's also unintended consequences like people gaming the system. I deal with landowners all the time. I'm on the edge of Chittenden County. I'm in Cambridge, Senator Westman's district. I'm right on the edge of Chittenden County. I'm right on the edge of Stowe in Lamoille County. It's the fastest growing part of Vermont. I meet with new landowners all the time. I met with one recently that told me he had a new 100 acres and wanted me to look it over. And I said, well, what's it like? He says, well, that's why I'm calling you. I've never seen it. I live in Boston. We are the beckoning country again. People are buying Vermont forest land, and they don't know much about it except it's in Vermont. They asked me two questions. They basically ask, well, if this is in current use, I want to stay in current use, or how do I get in current use? And they asked me, well, but I don't want to cut any trees. The two things they asked, I want to save taxes by being in current use, and I don't really want to cut any trees. It's a personal choice. So there's demand for this. I think much more demand than everybody realizes. Lots of people are moving to Vermont and they're not interested in the working landscape. They don't understand the connection between the working landscape and conservation. They simply want a piece of rural utopia. And those our resource base is going to suffer from those landowners if we don't make sure they understand that linkage between producing a crop. And we don't have, they certainly are not required to do extensive, heavy logging. We have the ESTA program that sets aside really sensitive lands. And we have long-term, thoughtful management done by foresters and recommended that grows trees late stage, great amounts of carbon storage. This is good forestry we do in Vermont. It's well respected around the world. If we take that away, we're damaging our state. And this program is really important to make that linkage between new landowners and conservation. Another part of gaming the system is never underestimate. Excuse me. I sound bad, Senator Westman. I have allergies. Apologize to the committee.
I know you have allergies.
Another way that they might game the system, and landowners are very thoughtful and very intuitive. They have resources, new landowners especially. This is going to incentivize parcelization even more. If I buy a piece of land and I don't want to cut trees simply by choice, but I don't have quite my 30% threshold, I'm going to approach my neighbor who's got a wetland complex or a steep slope or unproductive land or an ESTA. And I'm going to buy that from them for more money than they can understand. Well, who would want to sell a big chunk of their wetland that they're paying taxes on now? You sell it to your neighbor, the neighbor qualifies for 30%, they can enroll with no harvesting. That's going to happen. Landowners are very innovative. They really understand once they look at it. And new landowners have good attorneys and accountants and estate managers, and they will figure out how to game the system. That's also going to affect property values in the long run, and eventually that'll affect the current abuse reimbursement. As those lands that are marginal now go up in value, that's going to make an impact. The FBR commissioner, who I respect tremendously, said he really doesn't want to do any harm with this legislation to the program. Many of your advocates for this say they don't want to do any harm, but it's already done harm without being passed. The House Ways and Means Committee is going to look at and requires in this bill The rates for all reimbursements for all categories of land. That makes me very nervous. That could cause harm. What's that going to mean? How do we have any predictability that we're going to be reimbursed at the levels needed for productive forest management? We've opened that up already, and I don't think that's going away. In the past, and another piece of damage that's been done, and you'll hear later testimony from advocates, current use used to be, in my day, the most important thing that we all agreed on, both environmental advocates, forest industry, landowners, foresters. We all agreed it was too important to mess with. That was like a sacred pact. That's been shattered now. You're going to have environmental advocates in here now saying this is a great idea. And you have forest industry and people like myself saying it's a bad idea. You're starting to erode that common good that we all saw in current use. And that's sad. That bothers me tremendously because there's things that really are important. In my tenure as commissioner, we passed the Estes, where you can set aside land that really shouldn't be harvested. Wetlands, steep slopes, riparian areas, old growth conditions, several others. When we did that, we did a lot of public involvement. We went back and forth with many advocates. And we decided to move forward in that because it was the right thing to do. This is not the right thing. When we did that, it wouldn't have passed if we hadn't put limits on it. So some of those limits have now been changed. Now you can have as much land as you want in an estate. Used to be 20%. They've tweaked the old growth category, make it more able to be enrolled more land. That's going to happen to this as well, making the eligibility for more acres possible. That's extremely concerning. Well, I'll close and ask you to really look at this carefully. There's nothing to be lost by not passing this. It's really something that needs to be looked at with tremendous rigor and really carefully. This is a very important program for Vermont. Don't cause an issue that really causes major problems over time. Forest and Parks is not out there telling people you have to cut your trees right now. It's a long-term commitment for productive management that has flexibility and allows for unique habitat to be protected without harvesting. Let's take our time on this. That's really what we can do. Really setting the standards for a no harvest category in current use is, I believe, irresponsible and damages the program tremendously in the future. And again, I look long-term. I'm a forester. I don't look out 5 years. I have to look out 100 years or more. So please take your time. Please be thoughtful. Do what you want. I think history will remember what we do together. Thank you, and I'll take questions best I can. Sorry about my voice.
No problem. Thanks for hanging in there and getting through all that. I wanted to, if I don't know to what degree it's useful to think of the ESTAs as sort of a test case for the potential impact. Is that sort of a model that we went through and that lets us see what might happen under this bill? Can you speak to that like this? Does our ESTAs experience tell us? Because I think, remembering right, people worried that any land coming out of that production requirement might erode the base available for productive harvesting.
Yeah, when we developed the ESTAs, it had a tremendous amount of boundaries around. Basically, that has to be really important land that shouldn't see harvesting. Very steep slopes, riparian corridors, wetlands, old growth stands. So it's a very limited amount of land. Although in my practice, I work in 5 or 6 counties in northern Vermont, and I have prescribed ESTAs in every county. I've had all of them approved. I do them regularly. There are small portions of land scientifically that just shouldn't see timber harvest. That just is not the same for the entire parcel. It's very rare that you have an entire parcel that shouldn't have harvesting. In this case, 70% of that parcel might be highly productive land that can now, by landowner choice alone, just be set aside. So the ESTAs are working. They're a good program. They were the right thing to do. They haven't set aside huge amounts of land, but they've set aside very important pieces.
Okay. And is there an upper threshold for how much of a parcel can be defined as an ESTA?
No, it's scientifically applied. So if you have, let's say, a wetland, and the wetland takes up more than 20% of your property, you can put the entire wetland or a steep slope or area. It's done by the recommendation of the forester on the ground and approval of the county forest.
Another question I had based on your testimony was you were talking about new owners who come in and say, I want to be in UVA for obvious financial reasons, and I also don't want to cut trees. And then you have to tell them it's not the right program for them. What do they end up doing? I don't know. I'm asking you to generalize. It's anecdotal, but most people say the tax benefit is worth it to me. I'm gonna, enroll in a plan and do limited harvesting or whatever.
Well, they take two paths, and I gauge them based on their interest. If they are philosophically opposed to timber harvesting, I tell them this program is not for them, and they happily, very capably pay the extra taxes. It's not usually an issue for the new breed of landowners I'm seeing. If they're just hesitant and they don't know about timber harvesting, I show them, usually on their own land, where we've harvested in the past successfully, why that trail system they love is an old skid system. I'm able to get a one-on-one with that landowner and show them what timber harvesting and forest management is. And most all of them come around that simply are not philosophically opposed. They're nervous. They're not aware of what happens. When they see what a professional timber harvester with my direction can do, they're very happy and they're more than willing to enroll.
Okay, thank you. Any committee questions for Mr. Wood? Well, thank you for coming in, and I appreciate you always have the 100-year perspective. Oh, I did have one more question, sorry. You mentioned climate change, the role of forest in climate change. I'm guessing some folks will be thinking this bill as oriented to helping forests be part of the climate change solution. If you were starting from scratch to try to support forestry in a manner that maximized its capacity to help manage our way through climate change, what would you be looking at? You said, use value is not the right technique. So what comes to mind for you in terms of?
Use value is the right tool for helping climate change because it keeps forests and it keeps us growing trees. Having more trees and more forest is the best thing we can do for climate. Setting aside land to be not cut, depending on what it is a minor component of that, Vermont. It's simply not the panacea for climate change. Mid-age, rapidly growing, maturing trees and well-stocked forests are the best for carbon storage. Old growth stores the most once it reaches that cereal stage. But we have very few of those forests that are there, but it doesn't sequester as much. That's the fact. You need both. You need a lot of forest is the key. We also have issues with climate change, such as invasive species, trying to push for adaptation and mitigation. We need to grow species differently over time. We can best do that through active forest management. We need to encourage species that are more resilient, species like oak, red maple. Maybe there's going to be winners and losers. We can move our forests towards a more resilient state with active, thoughtful forest management. Once we set it aside, someday it'll store more carbon. But for the next, again, 100 years, I purport that active forest management is much more important and valuable for climate.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, and good to see you. And hope your allergies clear up soon. For that, I'd like to go to Mr. Sayre. Good morning, Bill.
Morning, Chairman Ray, as I join you and try to learn how to use this new technology. I appreciate the opportunity to testify for your committee, all the members, most of whom I know one way or another over the years. And I want to bring to your attention today the concerns of a great many people who depend on the working forest as a resource base, and ask you to be very cautious as you make changes in a program that has been critical to improving the productivity and the quality of the resource base we have, and that one that creates many benefits that people don't fully realize until they're gone. The working forests have been realized as very important to the character of Vermont, to the recreation, to the tourist industry, to the wildlife, to hunting and fishing, to water quality, to air quality. And recently, in the last 20 years, which is recent in the history of 3 or 4 billion years, we've learned about how forests can play a role in absorbing and storing carbon dioxide. We have much to learn there. We have differing opinions at this time of the way they can contribute, but that's not been appreciated over the years, and I think we're starting to learn that benefit too. The use value program, as Jonathan explained, is perhaps the single most important and successful conservation program we've ever had. It was created with a purpose to balance the productivity of the forest with the environmental benefits. And what this change in legislation does, in my view, is to start the process of eroding that resource base and unintentionally weaken all the benefits from the working forest upon which we rely. I should say also that we respect people who have a different view than we do. We respect their view and the people themselves, of course. There are no villains in this process. There are no heroes, except for maybe the working forest. And when we make immense and profound changes in a law that we don't fully realize until years later, then it's often too late to reverse the change. And I think that's what's going to happen here if we go ahead. No one knows for sure. There's very little that we know for sure about anything, except that we should be careful. So I'm going to give you a few questions to consider as you go along. We often hear about the 7th generation in environmental issues, and most of us fully support that view. But we should also consider the 7th generation in the economy. The interdependencies in the economy are just as great as they are in the environment. As a matter of fact, in the working lands, the working forests, the working farmlands, they're even more profound. And when you pull at the threads of one of those, you affect the rest. We should consider the effect of the financial situation that our state, our nation, and our world are in at this time. I don't need to recount for you all the international crises that are underway, nor the effects of the pandemic, and nor the war in Ukraine, nor so many other issues. But what I do know is that when we borrow money to the extent we have as a nation, and it was for a worthy purpose, it was a terrible pandemic that we had to fight, or we would have regretted the consequence of that. But now, as in the past, when we borrowed a lot of money to fight a war, to fight terrorism, then afterwards we had to tighten our belts and get back on track, or we lose the luxuries and the prosperity of a free society, the economic prosperity that makes it possible to even have this discussion today. We mean no disrespect, by the way, of the people who say we have a looming crisis in climate change. But what has changed? It is this financial situation. We're going to have to figure out a way to balance competing public policy objectives. That's what's changed from even a couple of years ago. Never mind 30 or 40 years ago when this was not the case. So it causes me to think about looking at the way we can absorb carbon dioxide, and there's a lot to discuss there, store it, and yet allow people to make a living by harvesting the timber and transporting it to the mills, and if possible, earn a living by adding value to it through making lumber or paper or other wood products. That may not be necessary when society has trillions of extra dollars that they don't know how to spend. Then you can buy up all kinds of resources, and that's fine. And that feels like it's the case right now, but it's an artificial and temporary state of mind, state of economy. It's the same as if you got a credit card and sent the bill to future generations. That's what Senator McCain talked about, intergenerational theft. And we're not thinking about that enough today. You all know about the issues of demands on the public treasury over which you're making decisions. Please think ahead as to the effect of what will happen when we have less and less land that provides a living to the people who work it. We have to find a way to create a balance. And the best way to do that is to continue keep our working forest working. And if we don't, we won't notice it first. But as Jonathan explained, and many of us strongly believe, it causes an instability and unpredictability, not only in the industry that depends on the resource base, but in people willing to invest in working forests. They have plenty of choices. They can invest in other states and other parts of the world. Here's a couple more unintended consequences you should consider. When we reduce our working lands here, we place more demand on the forests of other parts of the world. So we might think we're doing good by reducing the amount of wood that's harvested in Vermont. But if the effect is to increase it in Southeast Asia or South America or some other place, Africa, then have we really helped the environment? Do we feel better about that if we think about the unintended consequences? Here's another question. We have just across the lake 2.4 million acres of wilderness of this kind that can never be harvested, at least according to their existing law and constitution. I made a note before I have to leave that I remember visiting with Lola Aiken about the about the belief of her husband about wilderness, and he said, and he said to her that yes, some of it is good, and we all agree on that. But at the time, we were in the midst of a controversy which comes and goes over the decades of should we ever harvest any trees at all, or is it good to harvest or not? And she said to me that he did his best thinking when he was sitting on a stump. And to me, that tells us a lot. We have to be careful. We have to exercise the precautionary principle when we change the ecology of the rural economy. And we should talk to the people, more people who earn their living that way directly from the economy, and see if there's a better way to achieve the goals of this legislation. There is. It can be done under existing law and regulation. And so I encourage you to invite more people to testify before you make these changes, people who understand the role of working forests in sustaining our culture, the fire departments, voluntary fire departments, the rescue squads, the local select boards, all the community organizations, the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, the list goes on and on. When you lose the working forest, you lose the rural culture, and that's something that we do at our peril. I've got to run to an 11 o'clock obligation, and I look forward to a chance to visit with many of you in the future. But thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you for your testimony. And so I look forward to seeing you in Bristol when we adjourn, which is, I think, less than a month off.
Okay. Thank you very much. Bye for now.
And with that, I'd like to welcome to the chair, Mr. Larson. Good morning. And since Phil Sayre had to run, I'll ask this question of you because you'll know the answer too. Can you remind me of how many forested acres we have in Vermont, so that when we hear about 800,000 acres roughly becoming eligible in this program, the proposed program, how that compares to the total universe of trees out there in forests?
I actually do have that. Thank you. I'm Ed Larson. I'm the lobbyist for the Vermont Forest Products Association. And I've been doing that for quite a few years, better part of 25. For full disclosure, I'm also a forester licensed in the state of Vermont, and I do practice forestry in Vermont part-time, but I do. And I speak on behalf of our industry, and we have great concerns about this bill. Answer your question, Mr. Chair, right off.
Well, we're 75% forested. Vermont is 6 million acres. So
Right.
that means we have roughly 4 million acres of forested land, 80%, which is privately owned, something like that.
Well,
Kind of a small
Forestry Park estimates the loss of 380,000 acres containing suitable accessible timberland of land that's already enrolled. That's 31% of the land that's already enrolled. That number I can give you. The 860,000 acres, which is eligible for this category, which would include the 630 already enrolled and then the rest of it, that amounts to about 17% of Vermont's forested land.
Okay,
So
that's
1 in 5 acres.
okay. So that sounds about right then. 4 million. They multiply like 800,000 by 5, and you're at 4 million. Okay.
Try not to be redundant when I go back to that part of my testimony. Okay. So, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here to speak to you. It's great to be back in the building. I live a mile and a half away for 2 years, you know. It's kind of nice getting here. So Act 235, 1979, 43 years ago, the current use program was created, enacted in the law. By the way, I represent the Vermont Forest Products Association, which is currently enjoying its 45th year. So we're 2 years older than the program. And back then, when about 30 logging contractors and truckers gathered to organize the Vermont Timber Truckers and Producers Association, we had three main issues that we were dealing with. Trucking issues, of course, workers' compensation, and we still are dealing with those two issues continuously, as well as property taxes on forest land. So we supported the change to the current use, to create the current use program to help take the pressures off of landowners so that they could do good forestry. And but at that time, again, we were 100% behind it. We're tend to be libertarian times. It introduced the consulting forester into the mix. We didn't really have that before. Before that, county foresters did a lot of service to landowners as far as marking timber and helping them with planning and things like that. But there really wasn't anything like that before. So we were a little less resistant. And now we have a forester kind of getting in our way. And we've learned to adapt, and we've dealt with that. There are now 364 licensed foresters working in Vermont that never would have existed without this current program, providing fiduciary and excellent advice and work for landowners and for our sustainable forest products industry. Back then, we were looking more at public land as our timber base. The Green Mountain National Forest and state forests in the wildlife management areas were putting out great timber sales, nice sized sales, nice wood, very reliable, very predictable. And that was what we thought was going to be our main base going forward. And we were supporting the acquisition of public land. But it wasn't long after the creation of the current use program when appeals started to surface on various timber sale proposals coming from the Green Mountain National Forest. And the public officials backed off considerably. So we became more and more reliant on the private landowner enrolled in current use. So that is our bread and butter land now. We are much more dependent on the private landowner enrolled in current use. And we went from kind of resistant to having foresters involved to now embracing them. They're not just in our way, they're assisting us. They're part of the team. They're making a difference. We're all making a difference. We're moving together. So the commissioner spoke to you and said, you need to do no harm. You need to be careful. This needs careful thought. And you need to listen to a lot of people who have concerns. I appreciate the fact that you're doing that. As the two before me, which are two tough acts to follow, I'm more nervous because I'm following them than the fact that I'm here talking to you. It really deserves to be thought of. This deserves a lot more thought. Current use program is not the vehicle to accomplish goals that are outlined in Vermont conservation design. I'm trying to think of another jurisdiction, county, state, country, nation, that can brag, that can boast that it has 16,000 private landowners, all with management plans, high quality forest management plans, engaged in sustainable forest management, okay, on 65% of Vermont's land. I mean, where else can we see that? Our program is disingenuous to compare our current use program, the rigors of our program, with any other current use program in the nation. It is unique, and it is something that we can brag about. We can brag to the whole wide world that we have the best managed timber on the planet. We can. And it's privately owned land. Why do we want to change that? Why can't we capitalize that? Why can't this be the niche that Vermont creates? Yes, maybe we don't store the extra ton of carbon because we didn't leave enough trees standing, okay? But we have this unique capacity, and we're keeping it forested, and we're keeping our rural communities vibrant. These are the things we think about when we look at the fact that potential 860,000 acres, 1 in 5 acres, could be no longer available for us to be able to do those things, to create those jobs, to grow our economy. That's an option that we think is much more palatable and could be really, it can play upon the culture that we already have here now. So why compromise the integrity of this very successful program? Now, in Vermont Conservation Design, it lays out that 9% of old growth without active forest management is a goal that we'd like to have. We're going to get there doing nothing. 40 years ago, and currently, we are harvesting at half the growth rate. So carbon is being stored at twice the rate we're removing it. And that continues. So we're going to get there. We're not working on every acre. We don't. And with ESTAs, and if we protect those, we're working on those lands that are appropriate to work on. So it's, we're looking at it very differently. We're going to get to 9%. We're going to get to more than 9% with no change in law, no change in policy, just doing what we're doing now. What we worry about is that we will not have enough early successional habitats. Talk about old growth. How about the 0 to 10-year-old category? Okay, that requires careful management. Sometimes a forest fire can create that, not so much in Vermont. A clear cut can create that. And even other forms of silvicultural techniques can create opportunities for early successional habitats for very specific birds, very needy animals that really need that kind of a thing. We have very little of that now. We're under 3% in Vermont now. And we need to get that bigger. Now, Vermont Conservation Design says that we only need 3%. We disagree. We have biologists to say we need between 10 and 15% early successional habitat forests in order to really be sustainable in forest health and sustainability for our economy, as well as wildlife habitats. So we think that more thought should be brought into how do we really want to take care of Vermont's forests and provide all the benefits in a more balanced way. I don't know if Fish and Wildlife Department has even chimed in on this bill. It might be good to hear from them because of that very reason. Adding a forest reserve category cuts the forester off at the knees. There's magic in that conversation. Woody spoke to it. You know, I meet with landowners a lot too. I don't see quite as many landowners as Woody, and I'm in Washington County, Orange County. The development pressure is not quite as great as it is up there. Changes are taking place, but turnover is not as great as over there. So I'm talking to usually children of landowners during the transition many times. And to be able to talk to them about how they can be part of the working forest and be engaged. I have a landowner who has a Fifth Avenue apartment right across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He's a very colorful individual. And he did just like what Woody was describing. He came, he said, I want to be in Kearney, so I don't want to cut trees. I said, why? He said, well, it's dirty and messy, and I don't want to be a part of that. So let's have a conversation. We took a walk. He did it. Now it's been about 10 years. We just did the update a few years back. And I talk to him occasionally, and he says, you know, when I go to a cocktail party in New York City, I don't just brag about how I own a woodlot. I brag about how I know a couple of loggers in my town. I know the farmer who makes my field. I've got a forester. I am in management. He was very proud of that. That magic goes away when you don't get a chance to take that walk and have that conversation, because yes, we can pigeonhole you into another category where you don't have to manage the trees. So that's a concern. So now forest management has been given a bad name in some of these bills lately. And we never thought that would happen. We thought we were making a lot of progress in talking about working forests and how important we are. Forest management protects tree health, biological diversity. We protect water quality, and we've proven it year after year. We enhance wildlife habitat, and we do better at that every year. Forest management does store and sequester carbon. It is not considered development, and we do not exacerbate flood situations because of the harvest that has taken place somewhere upstream. And the beauty of it is the landowner can realize a return on their investment in addition to all the other benefits they have in owning that property. So I already talked about the harvest ratios. So So I already talked about 860,000 acres, 17%. Talked about the fact that 380,000 acres is 31% of the land that's already enrolled. So if a landowner decided to switch into this category, which they can do, they can port in. If they all did it, it would be 31% of what we're already working on. So we would lose access to valuable timber resources to support our rural economy. We lose opportunities to enhance habitat for important wildlife species. If the landowner sells their carbon, then we lose that benefit as a state as well. All property owners in Vermont will need to shoulder the burden from the loss of tax revenue from reserve forest land. You see, currently I'm able to protect this program and defend this program that is not a subsidy, that it is not a tax break, that it is an income method of appraisal based on the productive capacity of average forest land in Vermont. When we create categories where there is no income coming off the property, and I had the same argument with Estes in the beginning, you no longer can make that statement. It now does become a bit of a subsidy, okay? And so it erodes the integrity of the program from a political point of view that I've always been able to defend, that this is income appraisal, this is not a subsidy. So I hate to lose that. And active forest management has always been the cornerstone of use. It was what began the program. So if you look at the bill, it changes the statement of purpose. Now, if you look at the statute online or in the book, and you look at the statement of purpose, you'll see that the footnote is only one. It had never been amended since it was created. In 1979, every word that's in there is still there. Not a single word was added or deleted in 43 years. You go to the next section, which is definitions. There are over 30 changes that has occurred. That's for all the actions. And then the next one down, 3 or 4 down, is eligibility. That has changed about 25 times, okay? But the statement of purpose has never changed. There's some wisdom in the creation of this program. It was able to endure 43 years without a single change, even though we have made changes to the program. We have consistently adhered to statement of purpose. And we can defend that. For the first time I've ever seen it in the bill introduced in 35 years I've been doing this, there is a change in the statement of purpose. And I don't think it needs to happen. Even if you do pass this, we still, statement of purpose still kind of lives, still kind of fits. And so I can work with that. When you talk about the fact that Vermont Conservation Design has set a goal, and with the 30% trigger that would allow you to enroll all of your land into a non-management status, with more than 4 times, if all of it was enrolled, would be 4 times greater than the goal that is set in Vermont Conservation Design. Maybe 30% is too low. Maybe a landowner should have 50% of ESTA type land before they could be eligible for this. You know, it's a political number. I'm looking at the math and the numbers and how it jives. Maybe we're reaching too hard, reaching too far, and the impact could be too great on the people I represent. Perhaps the thought is that people who are enrolled in this forest category should not be allowed to sell their carbon credits. Because I'm trying to think of what is the public benefit of enrollment in the forest reserve category. There's no income coming off the land for the landowner to be able to pay the taxes and other costs. There's no jobs being created in our industry, so we don't have the economic return. People argue the ecological services that are provided. It's hard to measure that or quantify that in dollars and cents. So carbon, if you sell the carbon credits, then that goes to a polluter somewhere else in the country. And we're not able to use that against our own emissions. So we lose that benefit. So I'm still yearning to find out what is the benefit. And my industry does not oppose old growth characteristics. We do not oppose some set asides. We think it's smart. And Woody has even made mention that maybe we can do better. And we don't disagree. But this is not the way to do it. And this could be too costly for us. You will get a fiscal note from Julia Richter. She did that in the way she used to. So she'll probably be here. I think she's on her to get that. So a few interesting things in her report. One was, which stuck out to me, a little paragraph in there that talked about a U.S. Department of Agriculture's National Woodland Survey in 2018. And it said that when asked how you rate the importance of timber products as a reason for owning forest land, and these are landowners that are in Vermont, 25% said that they thought it was not important or of little importance. 25%. I think that's a low number, or I thought that was a low number when I saw it. Because some of us may remember surveys that were done back in the 90s and earlier, usually from the Center for Rural Studies, that would talk about why you bought forest land. What reasons did you buy it? And timber products, forest management was always like 6 or 7, which would be to me, would be less than 25% that would be supporting or would be there for that reason. The biggest reason was privacy, just investment in land, things like that, recreation, other values that people have on forest land. So I always thought that, so when I saw that number, I was, look, I think that suggests, maybe anecdotal, but it does suggest to me that the current use program has brought a lot more people to understand forest management, to be appreciative of what we do as an industry, and to be proud of the fact that they're a player. Because I would have thought that would have been a lot higher than 25% who think it's not important or have little importance. So it's just a thing that kind of looked at and I was puzzled by it. And I thought, well, maybe that tells a good story. You'll also notice in the fiscal that she does talk about the current use advisory board and the work they do in setting the rates. This bill proposes to tie reserve forest category, like the Estes, to a productive forest category rate. Okay, even though there's no income coming off the land, it is using the income method of appraisal for establishing the use value appraisal for that land. I think it should be different. Now, in the bill, there's a study. Ways and Means Committee introduced a study to look at that, which I think is smart. I think that this bill shouldn't be enacted until after this study has taken place, because they may be putting their own number, tax rate, tax appraisal on these lands. Now, other states have a different rate for open space categories than they do for management. And usually it's double. So you could literally take, this will really help your fiscal impact, even though it doesn't look big now, it could get big later. You could reduce that by putting a use value for productive forest land times 2 and fix it. Because we cannot measure ecological services quantified in dollars and cents. Anything we do is a political number. So I'm just suggesting one. I think that is a smart thing to talk about.
Before I'm mindful of the clock,
I am too.
ask how much, if you can wrap up in the next couple of minutes. We have 3 more with.
I'm almost done. So the only thing I would end with then is, why can't we capitalize on what we got, and use it to our advantage, and play upon that, and make ourselves special, stand out. Yeah, maybe we're compromising a little bit on carbon, but we've got an economy that uses the forest, that keeps the forest intact, and we have the best wood products in the world, and we are inviting people here to add value to our forest products, and we are making Vermont a wood mecca, like North Carolina used to be. Now it's in China. We can compete with that. We've got the resource base. Let's use it. Let's capitalize on it. I think that would be a good future to have. We're already here. The infrastructure is in place. If we lose it, we will regret it. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for this George?
And this is a layman's, after all these years in natural resources law, I'm still going to be a layman. My understanding is that when current use was instituted, going back even more basic, that taxes are intended, at least in many taxes intended, to be based on ability to pay, to reflect ability to pay. And that land value was used as a criterion. because in an traditional agricultural state, how much land you had was a measure of how wealthy you were.
Right.
And that as of after the post-World War II era, the value of land for development purposes was considerably greater than its value as used.
Right.
Hence the word use. And the idea of current use was that land should be evaluated on its use value rather than its development value. Okay. Agriculture, dairy farming is a use. Silviculture is a use. Is wilderness preservation not a use?
It's a use, but it begs the question of how you value that use. That's why we were talking about what was in the joint fiscal note, as well as the study that was in the bill. So look at that.
Well, certainly as a frequent user of other people's land, admittedly, usually timberland. Okay,
But the most uses, of course, is trails.
when I convene with nature, it's usually on someone's timberland. Okay. However, when you get out, for example, you mentioned the national forest, the state forest, when you get out into those undeveloped, unused, hands-off lands, they are different. There's a quality to that environment that is worth going to, and I'm wondering is there not a social interest in preserving those lands?
I don't know how to answer that. I'm looking at it from the point of view that I've been living all my life.
Yeah, I know.
Sawdust in my veins and active management. So yeah, probably true. I think we all value it. We all have different ways of looking at the forest and value it in different ways. But having a consistent policy that allows the orderly planning of our future, which is one of the statements in the statement of purpose, this program really does go there for us. Not sure if I answered it completely. Senator, the first time I met you, you were standing on a snowmobile in front of the State House at a current use route. It was 1989. It was the second year that you underfunded the program. And you stood up and you said, make no bones about it. I don't care what they say up there. This is a tax increase. Everyone cheered and you got down and back and go. That's the first time I met you. And I was here when you were sitting next to me. So don't tell me you don't have to, you're total novice.
I wouldn't say total novice.
All right.
Just layman.
So thank you, and we need to, I want to move on, because we're going to start to run short of other guests this morning. Thank you, Mr. Starr. With that, I'd like to invite Mr. Hancock back on the screen to talk about 697, please. Good to see you again already.
Yeah, good morning. It's like deja vu all over again. It's good to see you both, or you all again this morning. And thank you for the opportunity to come and chat about H697. So for the record, excuse me, my name is Charlie Hancock. I'm a consulting forester working across the northern tier of the state. I currently also serve as the vice chairman of the state's Working Lands Enterprise Board, or the private sector lead there. I currently serve on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council. I'm a member of the Society of American Foresters, having served as the past chair of the Green Mountain Division, a member of the Forest Stewards Guild, and a member of Vermont Forest Products Association. I reference those kind of just as context, similar to what Woody noted in his testimony. These comments I'm giving today are my own and I'm not meant to represent the opinion of any of those bodies. I do want to take a moment to just thank Ed and Bill and Woody for their thoughtful comments here. I found myself nodding a lot as I heard them talk. And while sometimes I think, we might disagree a little bit on some things around forest policy, I think we have way far more in common regarding our perspectives on our forests and the importance of the industry than we don't. And I think this is the first time I've been in a committee with 4 other foresters, and it's pretty cool. And I would love to see more of that, because I think it's great and we have a lot to offer. So I think before jumping into the specifics around UVA and this bill itself, I just want to kind of consider the context we're discussing here from kind of an objective perspective, because I think that things are pretty clear that, you know, we need to look at old forest characteristics in light of their outsized benefits and account for the fact that they're underrepresented on our landscape here in Vermont and that we could benefit from more. I think that that principle, regardless of how you go about doing it, is well founded in science. So I think we can all at least agree to start there. Saying this is not to diminish, you know, the importance of well-managed forests. This isn't a either or a yes, or this isn't an either or. It's a yes and. We need both. As the bill notes, when we look at the challenges facing our state, specifically around climate change and resilience, a quote, diversity of forest management strategies and conditions are required. And that's what we need to really strive for. We've got Vermont conservation design to look to as a guide. We have UVA as one potential tool, you know, one of many to achieve these options. So I think we need to kind of consider the context there. And I really do want to emphasize that active management is not an impediment to meeting our climate objectives or maintaining intact forests. The current use program in its current form is really the reason why our landscape looks the way it does today. I mean, 2 million acres of enrolled land is a massive success and one that we need to celebrate. And I'm glad it was brought up so many times today. And it's really why we have the host of climate resiliency benefits that we currently do as a state. The program has really allowed the room for us to even kind of have this discussion that we're having today as we expand our lens around how we think about our forests and the role that they play given what we're seeing on the horizon. We're seeing new challenges, you know, they've been articulated here today, and as such, our tools, we need to be adapted to meet them. And I'm talking more broadly just than around tweaks we're seeing here in this bill, but more kind of holistically as we look at the whole portfolio of how we manage our lands. And I completely agree with Woody. I don't think we want to screw this up. I do differ, though, in thinking about kind of the impacts of this legislation on our shared landscape and on our working lands economy. You know, Ed touched on the statutory purpose of UVA, and so briefly, you know, I think he made a really good point. I do just want to kind of add that I think that when we consider the mandates for production and the mandates around protection of ecological function and the importance of the working landscape and rural character, we do need to kind of expand our lens around how we think about economic value. You know, it's not just the boards and cords that drive so much of what we do as foresters, and I can't emphasize the importance there enough of that part of it, but also as it's been brought up here, thinking about ecosystem services and how they're complementary with other economic uses. So these are questions that we're already wrestling with, and I think we're going to continue to, because they're pretty deep and they're hard, as Ed pointed out. You know, when we think about everything from how we establish the rates in UVA to broader long-term objectives, it's complicated, but I think we do need to kind of expand our lens as we think about how things are changing, given the landscape we're looking at. So getting back specifically to old forests, I think you've heard these numbers a number of times today, but you know, Vermont Conservation Design, which is a guide for our work, targets about 9%, or about 419,000 acres. Currently, we're at less than 1%. You know, it's also important to note, as Ed pointed out, that when we think about Vermont Conservation Design, this 9% old forest target is one of many targets in Vermont Conservation Design. As Ed said, it includes old forests. So again, we don't want to just kind of forget about everything else. We got to think about the whole package there. Significant progress has been made, as it's been pointed out. You know, 220,000 acres, give or take, probably will develop these conditions under the existing kind of forever wild easement framework that we've got. But it's only 218,000, 220,000. And so, you know, more is needed. And I think a consideration here is, you know, given the time it takes to develop these old forest conditions, we do need to start thinking about what the mechanisms are to do that now, because it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a lot of time. We also can't forget the ability of ecological forestry to address old forest conditions and characteristics. There's an important kind of distinction here to be made around restoration and passive management. And I think that, you know, we can happily highlight the existing opportunities in UVA around the existing ESTA framework to do a lot of this restoration work. The solution isn't simply to walk away. And I'd argue that in some cases that may be more detrimental to the long-term objectives we have than to thinking about smart, you know, restorative management on a lot of this landscape. So again, I probably sound like a broken record this morning, but the solution is the whole portfolio of options as employed as a means to meet the full suite of objectives we've got. Again, it's not either or, it's yes and. So thinking about the report that we've got in front of us and the resulting bill that we're looking at, I think the report and the resulting approach here is a really balanced approach in response to the charge the department was given around this question of UVA as one potential tool to reach these objectives around old forest targets, which again is only one part of a much broader conversation. As I mentioned previously, I serve currently still on the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Climate Council, and the discussion of the role UVA could play in meeting these objectives in the CAP it took up a lot of time in committee, and there was certainly a diversity of opinion there. We had quite a bit of a push for simply saying, nope, open the doors, let everybody in under passive management. Just, whoever wants to come in can be in current use. I don't have to do anything ever. It's the way it should be. It's all these reasons. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we had folks that, wholeheartedly argued against any changes there. So I guess I just want to point out that I think there is a credibility of process to appreciate here in the report we've got from the department, that it's not something that was simply submitted by interest groups or that originated strictly from some stakeholder process with undue influence on one side or the other. It's a proposal based on objective analysis as a means of finding a balanced path to a desired end that they were given. So I want to give them a lot of credit for the work that went in there. The important thing, though, with this whole thing is that we really need to be having a credible conversation about how to meet all the targets in Vermont conservation design. And this report from FPR presents just one set of modest opportunities for finding common ground and advancing just one portion of conservation design targets. Specific points on the bill, I think the eligibility criteria being strictly tied to on the ground conditions are good, or is good. Again, the Climate Council, we had a lot of discussions around how this might work and what we might do. There was discussion around whether or not we should just let, any parcel with a forever wild easement in, or other criteria there. And I do think that tying eligibility to on the ground conditions rather than to some legal mechanism like an easement or something else is the way to go here. Further, regarding the eligibility criteria, I think that we do need to kind of acknowledge that the 30% criteria that's been brought up is kind of an arbitrary number as far as what would trigger eligibility for the whole parcel in this reserve category. And I think that's kind of where, if we're going to have some debate, we can have some good debate. Is 30% the right number? How do we measure that against the impacts of how many people might enroll? How do they align with Vermont conservation design objectives? So yeah, I do think that there might be some good conversation to have around whether that's the right number or not. But again, I go back to the fact that I think a lot of deliberation went into this at the department, and I would defer to all of the background and emphasis and rationale that they have in their report for that. The impact on the working forest land base is an important consideration here, as it's been brought up a lot this morning. I totally agree that the comments made around the conservation multiplier effect of the working lands economy are critical, and they can't be discounted. Having a vibrant, viable forest products economy is keeping, the landscape of Vermont to a certain extent how it looks today, and it's keeping our forests as forests, and we can't discount that. I do think that the forest economy impacts of this legislation are honestly kind of unknown. Could harvest pressures shift elsewhere? Do we see a net loss in production? I don't think we can say that there won't be, and we certainly can't discount the impacts. I also don't think that we can really say that definitively those impacts will be fill in the blank. So there is some uncertainty there. When we consider the impacts though on the resource base, as previously asked, I think Senator Bray brought up the question around looking at the current ESTA framework, maybe as an example of how some of this has worked in the past. Currently there's 493 total in ESTA enrolled stands in current use. So 493 ESTA enrollments in current use across 16,000 plus parcels. And those account for about 10,000, 11,000 acres. So in the past 10 years, since ESTAs came into being, we've got about 10 to 11,000 acres enrolled. And if you recall that we've got north of 2 million acres enrolled in the program, the current estimate enrollment accounts for, well less than 1% of enrolled forest land in the program. So, I do question a little bit whether if this passes, it would just kind of be this mad dash to enroll every single eligible acre in the program in this reserve forest condition. And we also, I think, can't forget too that the criteria here does allow for a portion of a parcel to be enrolled in the forest reserve category. It doesn't necessarily mean the whole parcel does. So it is still an option of the landowner. I think Woody referenced these numbers, but again, according to the department's report, about 27% of all enrolled parcels would meet the reserve forest criteria. That's around 606,000 acres of forest land that are currently enrolled in the productive category. Further analysis in the report, if you read it, in terms of accounting for conditions which already limit active management on these lands, I believe it's framed as the productive forest trade-off, is really only about 287,000 acres. So if we're thinking about kind of, again, if we went all out and put every acre that could be into this category, how much actual land would be taken out of production? I think based on the report, you would see a net loss of maybe 300,000 acres as opposed to the 800,000 acres that's been referenced. And then I think, as it's been brought up elsewhere, there's other ways to think about the forest resource base in current use and whether we have access to it or not. I can look at the volume of existing work and UVA plans across the program, which isn't being executed, that could be. And I think about the opportunity there to, practice active management and have those lands in careful production. So, I do think that there's some degree of, getting the lands that we already have slated for active production and that have been in active production, actually in active production, is a big part of this too. So acknowledging time, I guess I'll just wrap up. I think that, I don't see this bill as really being that detrimental to the forest products economy. I think it will have an impact, certainly. I don't think it will kill the forest products economy or hurt it overall, in an incredibly negative fashion. I think that if we're worried about the forest products economy, I think what we need to do is start focusing on other things that are currently being talked about in the building. I think we need to think about, meaningful permit reform as it relates to working lands businesses. This includes Act 250 reforms that are being considered around ag soils mitigation, hours of operation. I think we also have to look to Act 250 reform to address the development impacts in our large forest blocks. I mean, if we're looking at having land come out of the active management forest resource base, then we have to look at the fact that we're losing about 15,000 acres of forest land a year being converted to development. At that rate, by 2050, we'll have lost somewhere between 400 and 500,000 acres of forest land. And that's actually land converted. It doesn't even take into account the fragmentation impacts of subdivisions and the loss of economic opportunity there. So, I do think that looking seriously at, how we consider development in these resource areas and any kind of criteria for review is really important. And I would love to see the FPA come out in support of that legislation if we're talking about protecting the forest resource base. We need to invest in our working lands enterprises. I would wholeheartedly, advocate for another $15 million of funding to the Working Lands Enterprise Initiative over the next 3 years. I mean, we have a huge unmet need that we're seeing. Again, I serve as vice chairman of that board. And when we look at the positive impacts of that program, they can't be understated. We got to fund partners like via HCB, Farm and Forest Viability, so we can keep these actual businesses viable as businesses as we have new ones or ones that are growing and expanding. We got to address issues like workplace shortages and training. We got to pivot to take advantage of market opportunities that we're seeing specifically connected to the climate economy. And we got to lift up our industry. The Forest Futures Plan that's being considered in the legislature is a big step towards that. I'd argue that we're just as important as ag. Don't tell Anson this, but I'd say we're even more important than ag. And so kind of getting us up on par with the agricultural sector is where we need to be. And then I guess most importantly, we need to kind of reframe this whole debate as an industry. It's been pointed out by, I think, everyone testifying today. There's this growing perception in the public, whether it's landowners or folks that are moving here and don't hold land, but this negative perspective on active management and harvesting. You know, if a concern here is that we're going to open up a reserve forest category and we're going to see a flood of enrollments to it, I think the big question there is why. You know, why is it that landowners don't want to cut timber? And I'd say that we're kind of losing the narrative here. You know, there's a number of organizations that are pushing essentially false narratives around what active management means. I'll point to a recent article in National Geographic. It's a magazine that I've loved since I was a kid. But this article was just one more example of this myopic perspective on our industry, perpetuating false narratives that just malign what we do. And it's an example of cherry picking science to come up with a conclusion that is totally not warranted by that research. You know, one example in that article is research from Vermont's own Bill Keaton that was taken completely out of context and spun in a way to make it sound like not cutting anything is the best way to reach our climate objectives. And so I think that as an industry, one of the most important things we need to do is get out in front of this and reframe this narrative and essentially consider that question of why Vermonters don't want to harvest and how they view our industry. So I know you've got one more to testify, so I'll end there. So Jamie's got time. But again, thank you for the opportunity today. And I will happy to answer questions if you got any.
Okay, thanks very much for providing more testimony on this bill. And I go right to Mr. Fidel.
All right, good morning. Good to see you all. Jamie Fidel, General Counsel and Forest and Wildlife Program Director with Vermont Natural Resources Council. Thanks for the opportunity to testify on H697. Here testifying in support of the bill on behalf of BNRC, but also the Forest Partnership, which is BNRC, Audubon Vermont, Vermont Land Trust, the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy Trust for Public Land, and Vermont Conservation Voters. And I've testified on matters in your committee before about the myriad benefits that provide this priority of trying to keep forests as forests and reversing the rate of forest land conversion and fragmentation, and specifically providing incentives for landowners to maintain intact forests is vitally important. And this is accomplished through a primary tool through the current use program. BNRC was at the beginning of the foundation of developing the current use program and have been a staunch defender of the vitality of the program. And that includes viability for managing working forests. And there's many, many policies that we've been supporting on the front to maintain the viability of our working forests in Vermont. And when we have these conversations, I sort of lament that they're easily slipped into this feeling like there's this black and white, you know, you're either with us or against us, like you're for forestry or you're for wilderness. And there's no way to actually be for both. And I'm here saying we're for both. We believe strongly that they both have a role in Vermont. Old forests, young forests, managed forests, landowners who have diverse values. If they're interested in keeping forests as forests, that's a win for Vermont because there are so many diverse functions that come from forests. There are a lot of values that come from forests. In mitigating the effects of climate change and having old growth or old forest characteristics is one of the strategies for us to mitigate climate. And so Charlie has already covered this, and I know we're short on time. So I've provided written testimony, and I've given in that testimony the basis for the climate action plan support. Basically, 4697, there were a number of recommendations in the climate action plan related to trying to maintain old or promote old forest characteristics through the UVA program. As I've provided the first of those recommendations here. There were others, and I think you heard Charlie testify that there were other proposals to look at sort of just generally opening up the program. Other states do in New England have open categories for passive management. But this proposal here would be one of the CAP recommendations. It was our understanding that the governor was opposed to the suite of recommendations in the CAP related to UVA. And actually, we're pleased that the Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation has provided a basis to support this specific recommendation that was in the CAP to develop this kind of category, which you have in front of you. So we do commend FPR for its careful and in-depth analysis that led to the development of the proposed reserve forest land concept. We support the concept as outlined in the bill, which would be development and as analyzed in FPR's report, which you have. And it's really based on, certain subset of criteria that relates to the ESTAs, which we've talked about, and site for land, which are relatively poor growing areas, special places or sensitive sites, unique geological cultural areas, steep slopes. In general, we're talking about areas that are sensitive, steep slopes, and I agree with Charlie. If you read the report, and there's a couple scenarios for overall enrollment based on whether you look at the whole parcel as a defining feature, or the percentage of forest land, and there's different acreages. I believe the approach that the department supports, it's more like 600,000 acres that potentially may move into this category if everybody took advantage of it and enrolled. And it is only a subset of that that's actually productive forest land. And so a lot of the lands are not productive for forestry. They're sensitive, they're steep slopes, they're areas that we normally wouldn't be trying to harvest anyway. And so there's a lesser degree of impact than I think may have been presented as sort of like a build out scenario for some earlier testimony. Vermont conservation design, as you've heard, is the guiding vision for achieving a resilient and connected landscape in Vermont, especially as climate change and other stressors challenge our forests. FPR's report states that UVA has an important role to play in achieving the goals of Vermont conservation design. The report says Vermont will only achieve the targets it has established for its forest conditions if the management strategies to achieve them are eligible in UVA. So I thought that was really important because we are talking about the role of both public lands and private lands. And we think it was really credible for FPR to acknowledge that UVA has a role to play here. VCD, as already mentioned, has diverse forest condition goals, both young and old forests. But this proposal here is focused on trying to boost the old forest representation because we only do have 1% in the state right now. And while we support both, the young forest and old forest targets, and we'll continue to support programs and policies to get at those, as far as this bill is concerned, the VCD calls for a geographic distribution of all forest types, specifically calling out matrix forests. So those are the most common forests that we have that dominate our landscape. They're roughly in 1,000 to 100,000 acres of contiguous land. Take a northern hardwood forest as an example. These are matrix forests. There are a lot, dominant forest community types. And Vermont conservation design definitely calls for their representation across biophysical regions. And so I just wanted to quickly share this with you because there's been a lot of talk about whether we're going to meet our targets or not, with or without this proposal. It's really important to understand that. And so the Nature Conservancy actually did some pretty scientific, rigorous analysis, working with information available from Forest Parks and Recreation and Fish and Wildlife. So go through the different biophysical region that we have, identify the VCD target of acres for old forests, and to analyze what's expected based on the types of conditions, types of legal mechanisms, the characterizations of, let's say, wilderness on Green Mountain National Forest or state lands. And so you see the expected old forest is what we expect to have through our designations right now, and the remaining target right here. And so you see that we do have a remaining target. We're not going to hit targets except for maybe the southern Green Mountains where we have a lot of national forests already. And so it's not surprising that we've maybe met that target already. But for all these other biophysical regions, we've got work to do to get there. And then if you look at this forest reserve status here, and you went with the 30% threshold of enrollment that the agency or FPR is providing, it shows the acreage that would be needed in each of these biophysical regions and the percentage, like overall the land that's available that would need to be enrolled. And so you could look at this, when you have more time. I think the take-home message is, in general, we're not meeting the targets through the available mechanisms that we have right now. This will help us get there over time. It won't meet it for all areas. And that assumes that we're going to have this massive enrollment in this program. We've talked about the ESTAs being kind of the foundation, the underpinning for enrollment in this. And I remember working with Commissioner Wood, I forget if he was commissioner or secretary of both, as we were working on the ESTA program. At the time there was confusion. People were saying, "Oh, this is going to lead to detrimental impacts to the working landscape too." But everybody believed in it and came up with a credible process for it. I do want to share though that there's only about 11,000 acres that have enrolled in ESTAs, so they're not overwhelming the landscape. It's a pretty narrow and modest approach that's been available for sensitive features, and that's the underpinning for this proposal, including also steep slopes. So I think that actually the practical nature of this as it rolls out is we're going to find, I think over time, that it's a modest proposal. I don't think the sky is falling here as far as this proposal is concerned about the impact it's going to have on working lands. It will help promote the representation of old forest characteristics that we have in Vermont for those landowners who choose to enroll in this category, and that's a value that we believe should be recognized in UVA and other policies that we have in Vermont. And so we'd like to find room to support this. It's a compromise among a number of strategies that were put on the table, many of which have a much more sweeping allocation. I think the department has done a credible job looking for a way to support the need to boost our old forest representation in Vermont. And I think time will tell whether this is actually successful or not. So we support the bill, we support the report back 2026 to look at whether this is actually even working to meet the goals. That'll be an evaluation point. So I think I'll leave it at that because I know you have testimony from Joint Fiscal available to answer any questions. Thank you. Hope that you will be able to find a way to support this bill, and we'll look forward to continuing to do our work to support the values in this bill and many other bills that are moving through the process, which are both geared at supporting our forests, including our working forests.
Thank you for your testimony. One quick question as Jude passes out the fiscal, when we go to Ms. Richter, but could the ESTA program simply be modified to allow reserve forest land, old forests should be accommodated within it? And do you know anything about why this isn't an expansion of the ESTA program as opposed to like a new methodology?
Yeah, it's really looking at sort of the ESTA as a foundation for a certain level of sensitivity or unique features. And then if you have those represented plus steep slopes and a couple of other features on 30% of your land, it's creating an underpinning that there's already a basis for a lot of lands that are unique, sensitive, not really appropriate for harvesting anyway. And then saying if you have that, then the entire parcel that you have could then move into this old forest category. And over time, then we would have, beyond just the ESTA that's represented on the parcel, other lands that could be managed for old forest characteristics. So I think it's, in a way, it's a continuation of some of the thoughts behind the ESTAs, but it's a way to maybe boost, more ability to get at old forest conditions using it as a basis. There's a lot of landowners who are going to be left out of it. So we've heard a lot of criticism for our support of this because there are landowners who believe that they should qualify and they won't under this, that they should qualify for the program. Why are they being left out from not having equitable taxation for the ecosystem services or forest functions that they're trying to support in a non-developed status?
Why would they be left out?
Because they won't qualify. They won't have these features on the land. So again, it's a way for me to say that this I think was an approach to try and build an underpinning for supportable forest conditions. And we're still interested in looking for ways to help landowners that are interested in maintaining undeveloped forests that may not qualify, have all the tools necessary through our tax policy to help them.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. I'll have to leave it there, and Ms. Richter, your bag cleanup. We're getting close to noon, but we're not going to clock out exactly, and so please jump in and help us understand the fiscal note. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Cardell.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Julia Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office for the record. Do people have copies of the fiscal note in front of them?
We do, thank you.
Okay, sure. So I'll just start off prefacing the estimate that it's really subject to considerable uncertainty. I'm sorry I've had to miss some of the testimony this morning, but I think the committee may be well aware that there's a number of variables at play here. So we made a number of assumptions for these variables, any of which could lead to significantly different estimates. The variables include, but aren't limited to, tax rate changes in future years, assessed value growth, the number of eligible acres, the per acre use value assigned to the properties, and enrollment rates. So keeping these caveats in mind, we estimate that in fiscal year 24, this would reduce education fund revenues by approximately $100,000 and general fund revenues by less than $50,000. We assume that over time, more parcels will join the program. So in 10 years, we estimate this bill will approximately reduce ed fund revenues by about 1.5 million and by 600,000 in the general fund annually. But once again, number of assumptions at play here, which could change these figures over time. So absent any other changes in policy, the base homestead yield and/or the base non-homestead tax rate would need to be adjusted to counter the anticipated decrease in education funds. So I'll pause there. I'm happy to answer any questions or walk through the analysis, whatever would be the most help to the committee.
Okay, well, thanks for those high-level figures. And did you, in terms of, looking in the note, there is an estimate by year 10 if all the eligible but unenrolled figures were, you have a variety of things in here. I guess one quick question I have is, how the cost of the state in terms of making towns whole, that portion, is that accounted for in terms of the reimbursement to towns for revenues lost because of the UDA enrollment?
Yeah, great question. That's captured by the general fund cost. So the education fund cost that I spoke about, that's what's those are the foregone revenues from the state property taxes, and then the general fund cost, that's that reimbursement.
Thank you. Any committee questions about this one? Right, so there's a lot of good detail in it, and so urge everyone who's interested watching our committee to read the note carefully. If we have follow-up questions, we'll get back to you. But thank you very much for pulling this information together.
You're welcome.